Welcome to another episode of Ton's 2 Cents podcast. Today's episode is titled The SBA Small Business Scorecard, a Disservice to Small Business. We will explore this implication of great inflation on the SBA scorecard and its impact on small businesses. I'm your host, Todd Wilson, and with us today is Steve Koprince, a managing partner at Koprince McCall Potroff LLC, who will share his expert insights on this topic. Steve and I have known and worked with each other for decades. And so, Steve, I think our industry knows you quite well. But thank you for joining us here today. And for those who may not know you, can you please say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself to our listeners who we call intellectuals?
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be here to talk about this topic that's near and dear to my heart about SBA's grading scheme for small business contracting. I do want just a minor correction. I am the former managing partner of Koprince McCall Potroff, former attorney, practicing attorney. In fact, my legal license is inactive now. But I am an attorney by trade. That's my background. Practiced law about 16 to 17 years, somewhere in there, almost exclusively for federal contractors. I've worked with over 1,000 contractors in my career. Most of them are small businesses, but some are mid-sized, some are multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies as well. So it spanned the whole gamut. At the end of 2021, I had the opportunity to pass my equity stake in the firm off to a couple wonderful former colleagues, dear friends, partners of mine, Shane McCall and Nicole Potroff, who continue to run that firm as a GovCon boutique, working with many contractors. I've moved into other things. I do some teaching with an entity called Gavology, which you may be familiar with. It does a lot of teaching for federal contractors. I'm on the board of directors for a tribally owned entity that owns several 8A and non-8A contracting companies. A former client of mine. It's a really wonderful organization. And I actually do a lot of volunteer work now. I'm on the board of directors and volunteer frequently for a local nonprofit agency here in my hometown of Lawrence, Kansas. It provides disadvantaged individuals and families with early childhood education opportunities, wraparound services to help the families get through tough times in their lives and things like that. So all those things are kind of taking up my time now, along with being a dad. But this is probably a good point to say that as I sit here with you here today, that I'm just here in my personal capacity. The views I'm about to give don't represent any of the entities that I'm currently or formerly were affiliated with, just my personal.
I know old habits die hard, right? You know, when you associate someone with a certain organization, and definitely, you know, Shane and I have been involved on a number of other collaborations, which is great. And I love following you on LinkedIn. And I know a lot of our followers here at this podcast are interested in a lot of our guests and things like that. So, you know, you mentioned something that was kind of interesting because you did kind of come out of retirement a little bit, didn't you? It's like you retired, you came out of retirement, but you will forever be, you know, associated with GovCon. So how are you liking, you know, working from a remote location? Because I know you and I said, to heck with DC, to heck with the East Coast, and kind of, you know, like move out to the central part of the country here. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, I am at this point retired from practicing law. I guess you never say never, but at this point, I don't have any plans to go back to that. I do get folks who reach out to me actually somewhat frequently asking, hey, am I still practicing? You know, it's very flattering, but I refer them to Shane or Nicole or other folks that I know and trust in the field, which are many, because I'm just not doing that now. But yeah, I'm not somebody who's good at sitting around just watching TV, right? I'm never going to be that kind of retiree, whether it's at, you know, my current age or if I'm 85. I'm always going to want to have projects. And I love government contracting and being involved in the industry, even in a different way. So I've kind of gotten more active in that, posting a lot on LinkedIn. I've got a newsletter there you can follow on LinkedIn. But yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, you know, this is long before the COVID pandemic led to a lot of the uptick in working from home and all those sorts of things, and remote work is probably never going back to where it was before. But back in 2012, when I was living in DC, we made the call, my wife and I, to move to the Midwest, which is where I have my my family roots, and I took the leap of faith that that you could be a government contracts attorney not in DC, keeping in mind that government is nationwide, the contractors are nationwide, and that I didn't feel that it was necessary to have that physical presence all the time in DC, although I go back and forth for various things to be successful in that field. And that turned out to be correct, and now it doesn't sound so crazy, but back in 2012, it was definitely a pretty unique circumstance to have a GovCon attorney who was not DC located, just like I'm sure in your case, Tana, it was not the normal court. You probably got the same comments I did when you packed your bag.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're like, "What's in Texas?" It's like, well, there's a lot of things in Texas. There's a lot of
things going on there. A lot of things. So, and that's not to say I love DC. It's a great place, but this Midwest, it was the right place to raise our kids. It's working.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, let's just cut to the chase and jump right into our discussion here today, because I know that you blog a lot about this, and there's a lot of things in the news with the veteran-owned small business certification and the SBA and things like that. So I think this is such a very timely conversation that we're having. So to kick things off, like let's kind of get a straightforward overview about and understanding the small business, the SBA Small Business Scorecard. What is the SBA Small Business Scorecard, and what is it supposed to really achieve or inform us about?
Yeah, and so the SBA scorecard has its origins in congressional legislation. And so the SBA, of course, Small Business Administration, is the agency responsible for overseeing many things, but in our context of our conversation, for essentially overseeing the government's efforts to do business with small businesses, to get small businesses involved in federal contracting, to maximize contract opportunities, both at the prime contract and subcontract level for small businesses, and for various socioeconomic subcategories of small businesses, of which there are four-ish, depending on how you look at it, major socioeconomic subcategories that are tracked by the scorecard, which are your service disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, your small disadvantaged businesses, which include 8As, your hub zones, that's the historically underutilized small businesses, or folks from historically underutilized business zones, and your women-owned and economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses. And so the scorecard is really meant to be, it's like a report card, essentially. What Congress said is, look, SBA, we've established goals. We've established goals in legislation for awarding prime contract dollars to small businesses, and those four-ish, because there's subcategories like EDWSB for those subcategories. And we want you, SBA, to give us an overview of how the government is doing. And so the statute's been tweaked a bit over the years, but what the statute essentially says is, look, SBA, we want you to rate the agencies, to develop a scorecard. And as we get into it, and I'm going to give some constructive criticism of SBA scorecard, the SBA has structured this with very broad overview by Congress. So most of what we're going to talk about is going to be a criticism is really, sorry, SBA, it's directed at you, and that comes as a place from love. I love the SBA, I really do, and so it's constructive criticism for an agency I love and respect. But SBA has developed this scorecard at Congress's direction to measure essentially the government's success in providing opportunities to small businesses and those four subcategories of small businesses. And Congress has given SBA some very broad direction as to what that scorecard should look like, and then has left it to SBA to do the rest, to structure that scorecard in a way that hopefully will fulfill the congressional intent, and that will help hold agencies accountable, both for good outcomes, like agencies that do really well should be rewarded at least with press releases and things saying how well they're doing, and the ones who are doing maybe not as well have maybe not as good a score, and that encourages them to do better moving forward. So it's essentially meant to be that report card. How is the government as a whole doing when it comes to providing contracting opportunities to small businesses and those subcategories, and then at the agency level, the SBA measures 24 agencies. And how are those agencies doing? So the government gets a grade itself, overall grade, and each of those 24 agencies gets a grade as well. That's essentially the scorecard in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I know that there is some criticism, and there are some issues. There's a lot of people in GovCon, like Guy Timberlake and a few other, notables in our industry who kind of take issues with how they collect their information, how many times, certain agencies will count credits for, like for different things. But you're right. It is a really kind of a good way, at least, to kind of spark some conversations about maybe why we're falling short or maybe where you're having some challenges. And it does give kind of GovCon, contractors a way to say, oh, well, hey, agency, you could do a little bit better, with your score, and here's how you could do that. So I think it's a good way to open up the dialogue between both industry and the government on how both of us could probably do better, right? It's a partnership. It's not just incumbent upon one side to help fill those roles and goals.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I think the idea of the scorecard is a good one, for the reasons you said. I mean, it gives is supposed to give small businesses and the public at large, as well as policymakers like members of Congress themselves, a snapshot as to how the government's doing when it comes to serving the interests of small businesses and government contracting. And so, done well, I think it could be a really valuable tool. My concerns, and I think Guy Timberlake and others who've also expressed concerns, and we have some of the same concerns, as well as maybe some that are, I emphasize more, or Guy emphasizes more. But those in the field who've had concerns say, look, not that we think the scorecard is a bad idea. I haven't heard anyone say that, whose opinion that I respect anyway. But the way it's being implemented is not really meeting the needs of the small business community, and in fact, in some ways, as the headline of our talk is doing a disservice to the very small businesses that SBA is intended to serve. That's again my opinion.
Yeah. No, and we are here to get the unfiltered opinions of our guests. So this is great. You're in the right place, Steve.
Excellent.
So let's move to talking about some of the consequences of great inflation and some of the hidden truths there. And this is something that I'm not as knowledgeable about as you. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion about great inflation on the scorecard. What's the real deal here? Is it like giving everyone a trophy for showing up? Like what, explain this to me a little bit more.
That's sort of what it's turned into, and it's a result of the framework. So please feel free to interrupt as I go on to try to explain this at a high level. But let me start with some stats that I think will surprise some of your listeners. So the government, as I've mentioned, the SBA rates 24 agencies on the scorecard, and it gives them letter grades. Congress, by the way, didn't ask for letter grades, just to develop a scorecard. SBA decided on its own volition to do letter grades some years ago. And then SBA internally developed a framework as to what it would take to earn each letter grade. Well, last year, and this is not an aberration, by the way, last year, in the most recent scorecard that came out, which is for the 2023 fiscal year, SBA evaluated 24 agencies, and 22 of them earned a grade of A or A plus, and 2 got Bs. And so you say, wow, the government must be doing really, really well. And the government as a whole got an A. And so the headline then, and the SBA press release that accompanies the scorecard, and that's another topic I'll get into a little bit later, trumpets, the government got an A, the agencies did so well. But when you dive into the weeds, it's really a mixed bag. That the scorecard is not reflective of what's actually happening with respect to supporting small businesses when you go beyond that letter grade that SBA is assigning, or that press release that every single year touts how well the government is doing. The fact is that Congress, in its directive to SBA to establish a scorecard, has asked SBA to track 15 specific metrics. And so those metrics would be how well the government is doing at the prime contract level, in terms of awarding prime contracts to 5 categories of businesses. That's small businesses as a whole, and the 4 socioeconomic subcategories. Congress has then asked SBA to track how well the government is doing at the subcontract level with respect to those same 5 entities. That's 10 metrics. And then the Congress has asked SBA to evaluate how well the government is doing at increasing the number of small businesses in each of those 5 categories that are participating in contracts. That's 15 total metrics. And each of those metrics has a goal associated with a specific number. There's a goal that the government is supposed to try to meet. So, for example, the goal for women-owned small businesses at the prime contract of 5%. The goal for small businesses as a whole at the prime contract of 3%. So on. There's metrics that the government is supposed to try to meet. The number of businesses that's really heavy increase or decrease is just kind of a binary metric there. And for the prime and subcontracting metric, it's a percentage of prime contract dollars or percent of subcontract dollars. So 15 metrics. How many do we think the government with its A grade met? Well, the government met 7. They met 7 out of 15. They missed 8 out of 15. And so the government missed more than half of its metrics that were assigned by Congress and got an A.
They got A's and B's. Right.
They got an A. And the government got an A. DOD, and I don't mean to pick on DOD, but it's an even more interesting example, missed 10 of its 15 metrics and still got an A. They still got an A. And so that's why I say at the start that just looking at the letter grade is not reflective of how these agencies are doing. And so when you can have the government miss more than half of the metrics that Congress has put in place for SBA to track, or an agency miss 2/3 of the metrics that Congress has put in place for SBA to track, to me, the fact that that entity, that government as a whole, or the agency is still getting an A is not right. It's not right. It's not reflective of the actual performance of the government, which, so again, in fiscal year 2023, there was definitely some good news, and some agencies did really, really well, genuinely, and deserved their A's and deserved their A pluses, in my view. But when you look at the scorecard and you look at the press release accompanying it, only thing that you can have as a high-level takeaway is, wow, the government's doing amazingly well at small business contracting. There's nothing that needs to change. There's nothing that needs to improve. And clearly, when you go to the metrics and see that the government as a whole missed more than a half of the 15 metrics that are established, that's not accurate. And so there's a huge disconnect, in my view, between the grade that SBA is assigning on the one hand and the actual performance of the government on the other.
Has anyone called them on it? That just seems, it almost seems like new math, right? Not to say like it's girl math, but I guess it's GovCon math, or government math.
It is, and there are some folks out there who have, I've said things. There's a senator who's put a proposal out there. We can talk about it in a little bit to maybe change some of these things, but one of the pieces of feedback that some of the critics of the grades have gotten is, again, this is just at a high level, I'm not naming names or anything, but one of the criticisms that seems to be out there is, well, you don't understand the framework. The framework requires us to give A's in these cases. And I've said to that, no, it's not that I don't understand the framework, it's that I don't agree with the framework. And so the framework that the SBA has adopted, and again, this is almost all SBA. This is almost all SBA, not Congress is doing. And again, I say this from a place of saying, I love you, SBA. I'm like the fan of the football team who is a fanatic but thinks you got to get rid of the quarterback. We think there needs to be a change, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is coming from a place of, I love you, SBA, but this scorecard is not doing a service to small businesses, because what it does is it masks the problems that government has. And so one of the major problems with the SBA's framework that they've adopted, again, it has nothing to do with Congress. Congress did not tell them to do it this way, is that SBA has essentially equalized all the types of contracts, and there's no penalty for missing any of the goals. And you can essentially make up the goal by doing above that on one of the other goals. So let's take a simple example. Let's say that the agency has a 5% goal for women-owned small businesses and a 5% goal for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. And those are the current statutory goals for those two categories. So let's say that agency then it does 12% for SDVOSB. It does really, really well. And the VA, by the way, given its structure, does do this. They do 20% or something for SDVOSB. But let's say an agency does 12% for SDVOSB and does 0 for WSB, does nothing, absolutely nothing. Under the SBA's framework that they've adopted, the score for those two items, and this is not the entire scorecard, but the score for those two items combined is 12 points out of 10. The agency gets 12 points out of 10 despite doing 0 for WOSB. Nothing. Not a single woman-owned small business gets a contract, and yet the grade for those two categories is 12 points out of 10, 120%, and extra credit. And so let's take that one step further, because SBA has this whole weighting of formulas, and I ran an example before we had our conversation doing the math, so I'm not sitting there on a calculator right now. So here's, again, this is a hypothetical example. It's not happened in real life, but it shows just how crazy this framework is when it comes to missed goals and still getting good grades. Let's say that the government has, as we know, has a 23% goal for small businesses as a whole.
Okay.
Let's say that a particular agency or the government itself, let's say it's the government itself. Say the government itself one year comes along and does 50%. They award 50% of prime contracting dollars to small businesses. That's double the goal. Well, that's wonderful. But let's say that the government that year awards 0 to any of the socioeconomic categories. Nothing for HubZone, nothing for woman-owned, nothing for service disabled, nothing for small disadvantaged business / 8A. Well, what does that produce if we put it into the SBA's formula? Well, what we get is 130%, an A+. That the government gets an A+ that year, despite missing awarding 0 to any of the socioeconomic subcategories. And so what SBA has done is it essentially says that you can make up any deficiencies on one of these categories that Congress has asked you to track by going over on another category. And that's a policy debate that we can have, but it means that as the government year after year after year does not meet its woman-owned goals and does not meet its HubZone goals. And yet these agencies are still getting A's despite missing those goals every single year and many other goals in there too. And there's just not as much incentive when you say, okay, well, we can't find enough HUD zones to hit our 3% HUD zone goal, but we'll just do a few more 8A sole sources and that'll take care of the problem. And in terms of the formula, it does. It takes care of the problem.
It works.
It works. Yeah.
It works. So, I guess, when you make the rules, you're just playing it by the rules. And so that's, it's like, it's almost like cooking the books.
Except they're doing it. It's all legal. It's all above board. It's all within the framework. And yet and they say don't hate the player, hate the game. Well, that's what we're talking. We're talking about the game here. I don't blame any agency for making that calculation if that's what they're doing. And I'm not at all saying that agencies are trying hard. I know there's some great Ozaboos out there and others who are really working to hit all those goals that they can, despite the fact that the formula doesn't really affect their letter grade if they don't. And yet I can't help but think that it's a major disincentive when you know in the back of your mind that if you don't meet all your goals, no harm, no foul, you could still get an A or even an A+.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about legislative updates and like the path to reform. What's being done about this? Are there any legislative updates or movements in the works to kind of address some of these issues?
There's one that I'm aware of. Fortunately, I think this year, and I've been kind of beating this drum for a long time, probably since you and I first knew each other. I mean, years ago, I've been saying, hey, this scorecard's great inflation, it's participation trophies, it's not doing right by small businesses, and SBA is kind of straying from its mission to support small businesses by creating a system that supports its sister agencies more than supports small businesses by making them look good, making the administrations look good of both parties, by the way. This has been going on regardless of which party control the White House. This year I did see for the first time, and I'm not saying it's the only time that's been out there because I don't see every single piece of legislation that gets introduced, but this one actually made some headlines in the government contracting community. Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa introduced a bill that would make some changes, and she had a press release out there talking about SBA shouldn't be awarding easy A's. These are her words now, not mine, although I don't at all disagree. And she had a bill out there that would, at the congressional level now, change first some of the allocations that SBA gives, saying that maybe this is one piece that is dictated by statute, which is that SBA is supposed to put 50% of the weight on prime contracting dollars. And so when we talk about dollars being maybe overstated in the scorecard versus the number of small businesses in government contracting, which, by the way, is about half what it was 15 years ago. The number of small businesses goes down and down and down every year, which, again, is masked, I think, by the scorecard. And so she would reduce some of the weight that's given to the prime contracting dollars, and she would then, in her bill, would require the SBA second to more broadly consider the health of the small business industrial base as part of its scorecard, which, right now, like I said, the SBA is required to track the number of small businesses in government contracting and the number of each of those 5 categories. But the SBA scorecard gives it very little weight, 10%. And so I think, Joni Ernst's bill would say, hey, SBA, let's really consider whether this shrinking industrial base is deserving of only a 10% weight in the scorecard. And so and it would give some flexibility for SBA, again, as to how they want to evaluate that. And second, and this gets back to when we talked about your friend of mine, Guy Timberlake, it would limit, though not eliminate, the ability of agencies to double count or triple count or quadruple count dollars toward the scorecard. And again, this is something that has been criticized year after year after year, and I think I would share in some of those criticisms. Guy in particular has been beating the drum on this point. That is the notion, for those who are not familiar, that when an agency awards a contract to a small business, the agency can count those dollars multiple times for every category that business qualifies for. So let's say that you award a contract under a small business set-aside, and it's a small business set-aside competition. Any small business can participate as long as they're a self-certified small business. And so you award $1 million contract, and the winner happens to be an 8A and a woman-owned small business. Well, that agency counts $1 million toward its small business goal. It also counts $1 million toward its small disadvantaged business / 8A goal, and it also counts $1 million toward its woman-owned small business goal. And so the government is taking credit for $3 million worth of small business awards for a $1 million contract, triple counted. And that is legal, allowable, and it's the way things are done right now. That's just the system. Again, player game thing. So Joni Ernst's bill would not eliminate that, but would limit the agencies to double counting. To say you can only count an award for 2 categories, which some folks will still object to that and say, well, it should be just one fair. But right now you could count as many as 5. I mean, there's 5 categories being tracked, and so theoretically a $1 million contract could be counted towards $5 million versus goaling if the company that was awarded that contract met all 5 categories. And by the way, every time you award a socioeconomic contract, that company doesn't necessarily qualifies as a small business. So you're always at least double counted. Anytime you do a socioeconomic award, every last one of those awards is double counted because all of those companies are also small business. And so every time you see an 8A hub zone, woman-owned small business, service disabled veteran-owned small business contract, those dollars are being double counted, and they might be triple, quadruple, or quintuple counted too. So that's what her bill would do. I haven't seen progress on that recently. This bill was introduced several months ago. Again, I said this is, for me, at least recently, the first piece of legislation I've seen at least get some traction in the contracting community and get the discussion started at the policymaker level about whether this scorecard really is doing right by the companies it's intended to help. That is the small businesses, by showing AAAA 22 out of 24 times, despite missing all these goals. Is that really helping small businesses? Is it helping government help small businesses? And so I don't know if, I haven't seen, for example, the text yet of the Senate National Defense Authorization Act. Lots of bills like Senator Ernst end up becoming law if they do as part of the NDAA, and that text hasn't been published yet on the Senate side. So one thing I'll be doing is look at the NDAA to see if that bill, if it's not going to get passed as a standalone, and it might, finds its way into some sort of more omnibus legislation like that NDAA, or at least kickstart the conversation where in the next coming years Congress might do something. Now, I do want to reiterate here that SBA does not need congressional approval to change the system. That
right.
Some of the big picture stuff, like the 50% weight for the dollars at the prime contract level, yes, that is dictated by Congress. But SBA's hands are not tied with most of the stuff. SBA could, for example, get rid of letter grades entirely. SBA could apply a penalty for not meeting specific goals. SBA could give more weight to the metrics right now for the number of unique prime contractors, small businesses. They're only given 10%. That's not dictated by Congress at 10%. The SBA could give that more weight. So SBA could disallow or limit extra credit. That SBA could say, by the way, that that yes, we love it if you go over on the 8A category, we're going to give you some more credit, but maybe not as much as it would totally make up for not meeting your HUD zone goal. And SBA has a lot of flexibility here. Congress has only given big parameters, so I do want to be clear that yes, I think it's great that policymakers are focusing on it, but a lot of this is SBA's choice. They've chosen to implement a framework that has led to almost across the board A's in an environment in which the success of government in supporting small businesses is, in my opinion, definitively mixed. With respect to the very goals that Congress has asked the SBA to track.
Yeah. So as an aside, this is kind of similar to this discussion. Is I know that a lot of small businesses are concerned and disheartened by some of the large business subcontracting goals and them meeting what is stated in their subcontracting plans, that they'll meet a certain number, certain percentages. And, small business subcontracting plans are routinely, required as proposals, and they're always goals, right? So that, they don't have to meet them. But it is very disheartening for small businesses that, to join these teams and be part of a larger business, and then they don't see any subcontracting dollars. And so what do you know, what do you hear, as far as, any type of support or advocacy or penalties, from the SBA when large businesses don't meet their subcontracting plan?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we've been talking a lot about these small businesses, and yet at the prime contract level, and yet a lot of small businesses who are doing government contracting get their start as subcontractors. They stay at the subcontracting level forever, or they do both. I mean, it's big business, and just as the government has goals for awarding prime contract dollars to small businesses, there are now two levels essentially of goals for subcontract dollars. So the government actually has subcontracting goals for federal agencies. It says that we want you as an agency to achieve these specific subcontracting goals essentially through your oversight of the subcontracting plan. And then, of course, as you referenced, then most, large, or I guess we'll call them other than small, because some of these companies say, well, we're mid-tier, whatever, but they're not small businesses. And so the SBA uses the phrase other than small. It's kind of cumbersome. And most people just say large, but I know some folks will object to that, say, we're not large, we're mid-tier. And fair, you're not Google, you're not whatever. I get that. But if you're not a small business, and usually when you win a federal contract over $750,000, it depends for construction or whatever. But generally speaking, you're required to have what's called a subcontracting plan, and that subcontracting plan establishes goals for you as the prime contractor to award certain percentage of your subcontracting dollars to small businesses, and then those same five categories, right? The same socioeconomic categories at the subcontracting level. And so, over the years, there have actually been there have been a number of complaints, of course, from small businesses in that these subcontracting plans are typically, at least historically, it's not necessarily being done that way 100% now, historically evaluated on the front end. In other words, we got awarded the contract, we showed the government our subcontracting plan, everything looks great, we're going to give 50% to small businesses, fantastic, and then done. Nobody looks at it ever again, and the practice doesn't end up being what the plan said it was. We were going to do. That we ended up maybe doing 5%, and so you had a lot of small businesses who have been in the position over the years of saying, we were promised a lot by large primes and given little. And this is not at all to pick on any particular large primes, and sometimes there's reasons for that to happen. But that's been the common complaint of small businesses. And so there actually have been some reforms. And I think, in my opinion, while some of these could go further, I think the ball has now moved to the enforcement court, because I think some of the rules are on the books now, and they're maybe not being enforced as well across the board as they could. So what did Congress and the SBA do over the years to try to improve this situation for small subcontractors? Well, one thing that SBA and Congress have done, and I say them together because some of it's directed by Congress and some of it's kind of elaborated by SBA, is say that there are going to be now specific penalties for primes who do not make a good faith effort to meet their subcontracting goals that they laid forth in their plan. And the SBA, and it's in the FAR now, I believe, as well, have set forth some examples of what it means to make a good faith effort to meet your subcontracting plans and goals. And so there is more potential penalty now for primes who don't do that. Another thing that is in the FAR now as well, and that, by the way, I think some large primes are not necessarily abiding by, is that a prime contractor is prohibited from prohibiting its subcontractors from complaining to the government about non-payment or non-use. And so one thing a lot of primes did historically is they would put in their prime contract something in their subcontract, something to the effect of, we're the prime contractor, we are the sole point of communication with the government, and you sub are not allowed to talk to the government about anything relating to this contract. And presumably that would include, or it would be in the teaming agreement if it didn't have a subcontract. That would include whether you were paid, whether you were used at all, the amount that you were used on the contract versus what was in the team agreement. Any subject was prohibited from if the prime put that in their subcontract or teaming agreement. And if small business goes and does it anyway, they breach their contract, and then a bunch of high-powered lawyers are coming down on them with like a ton of bricks. And so it's in the SBA regulations down in the FAR that a prime cannot prohibit its subcontractors from communicating directly with the government regarding payment or use, essentially small business subcontractors. My experience, some primes are still using their old subcontractor team agreements that have that language that violates the FAR SBA regulations. And so one thing for smalls to know when they're negotiating their agreements is that language is invalid. They need to write that out of the agreement. Say, no. The FAR says you can't do this to us, and then be prepared to drop a dime on the primes if they're not doing what they said they were going to do. And so that's in there as well. And then SBA now has the authority, and does do this sometimes, to do subcontract compliance reviews of large primes, where they can come in and say, we want to look at all. This is independent audit essentially. SBA can come in and say, we want to look at all your subcontracting plans for the last year, and we want to see, how well you did achieving those plans, et cetera, and do a full audit of it. Again, this is just my personal take, just anecdotally, I don't have data on this, is that, and those tools may not be enough, by the way. There may be more that needs to be done at the legislative level or at the regulatory level, but my anecdotal experience is that part of the issue, I think, is now on the enforcement side, that the contract officers or SBA, maybe it's a resource thing, are very focused on prime contract compliance and less focused on the subcontract compliance. And so I think that some of the violations or at least problems at the subcontract level maybe just don't get the attention that they deserve, and that if these subcontracting plans are being audited carefully, if everybody knew that that it was something that the government was going to take really, really seriously, and I'm not saying that a lot of contracting officers or agencies aren't, but maybe some aren't. Again, it could be a resource allocation thing, that there might be a change of mindset. And I think part of it is on the small businesses to understand their rights, to understand that they can talk to the government if there's an issue, to make sure that when they negotiate their subcontracts that they are not being intimidated into agreeing to provisions that are invalid, that are illegal, et cetera. To read through, I counsel any small business who's going to be a subcontractor, go to the FAR and read through what needs to be in the subcontracting plan and compare it to whatever teaming agreement or subcontract you've been given, and make sure that the agreement, because the prime's always going to give you the template that they want you to sign, make sure that agreement matches what the prime is required to do, and it doesn't include things that they're not allowed.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I advocate, and we do contracts review for our customers. And they're always very surprised when we come back and redline things for the large businesses. And they're like, oh, we can, we can say that, we can push back on that. I'm like, Yes, you don't have to sit there and take everything that's kind of shoved your way or, provided to you and say, here, sign on the dotted line. You really do need to advocate for yourself and to realize, because they don't want to, I don't know, they don't want to cause any problems or shake the boat or anything like that. And I'm like, well, I guess that's one way of looking at it. But another way is now, you signed up for certain things that maybe are, like you said, are cannot be, like are not legal, or like should not be, something that is enforceable, and whatnot. And I guess like a last thought about the subcontracting plans and meeting those, and any type of, like penalties, for not meeting it. It's like, I think it really is incumbent upon the SBA to pay more attention to that, and to really put that, in its hairs as far as something that they should be concerned about. Because uh, you know, for small businesses, typically they do come in and do rely a lot on subcontracts. And they join, teams and are part of, larger bid teams for some of these larger, type of bid efforts, because they can't go in it, as a prime, or they don't have the, like the expertise or the capabilities, in order to, uh, you know, fulfill the requirements, like as a prime. So as a subcontractor, it's one of the only few ways that they can get some of the past performance experience that they need in order to, to grow and to build, into their own prime relationships. But anyways, we could sit and talk about that like for hours, but I want to kind of move forward and talk a little bit more about some strategic actions for small businesses, as they navigate, like this landscape. So what are your recommended actionable steps, can small businesses take to kind of navigate this landscape? Should they try to lean on set asides, or look to be more, competitive, like in other ways? And like at Intellect, we teach our customers and our clients to be competitive. We bid on non set aside type of opportunities for small businesses, and they win. And so, like at the end of the day, set asides are great, but you do need to kind of, learn how to, be successful in a competitive landscape too. So, what are some of your recommendations on how to help small business be successful and more strategic in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. First things first. I've always said, and I'm on the legal side, but I also worked with enough contractors in my life that folks would often ask me questions that were not so legal oriented, but maybe just contract business oriented, and I would do my best based on my experience, not as a contractor, but working with so many of them, including many very very successful ones, to give them my 2 cents. And one of them is absolutely that, yeah, that you build and develop and market your business first, and your socioeconomic certifications second. What you want is a really great business that would hopefully be competitive in most markets. It depends who you're facing, regardless of whether it had socioeconomic certifications. And then you use those socioeconomic certifications as a value add, as something that agencies can get credit toward goals, and as ways to expand your competitive reach. And that when there are set aside opportunities, for example, that you can access those at the prime contract level, that you might not be able to otherwise do. One thing I would keep in mind here, and it goes kind of back to our goal, talk about goals and a government meeting its goals, and even back to our counting on talk about double counting, is that the unfortunate truth is, and this is just, I'm just going to say it like I believe it, is that not all the socioeconomic certifications are created. That there are many, many more opportunities available for set aside and sole source with certain certifications than with others. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a woman-owned small business certification. Again, I'm a big supporter of woman-owned small business certification, and I'm angry that the government can't seem to meet its 5% woman-owned goal. It's ridiculous. But it's, take a guess as to how much of the government's prime contract spending came through women-owned small business set-asides and sole sources last year. Remember that the goal for women-owned small business contracting is 5% of prime contract spending. The actual achievement was 4.8 or whatever it was. It was close to 5, but it wasn't there. So the government spent about 4 point something percent of prime contract dollars on women-owned small business awards to companies that had that certification. How much of that came from set-asides and sole source contracts? 0.29%. 0.29. That's how much of the government's prime contract spend was allocated through women-owned small business set-asides and sole source contracts. Most of the spend that went to women-owned small businesses came through contracts that were designated otherwise. Many of them were small business set-asides. Again, remember that then the government double counts because the woman has a woman-owned small business certification. They already, but you didn't have to be woman-owned to get that contract. You just had to be a small business. 8A. A lot of the 8A companies are also women-owned small businesses because the ownership and control requirements are, if not identical, close. And so if that company is owned by a woman, then they often have the women-owned cert too. And so it is striking to me that women-owned small businesses were awarded many more dollars, and I don't have the numbers straight in front of me, so I can't tell you how many off the top of my head here, but it was many more dollars when I looked at this through 8A set-asides and sole sources than through women-owned set-asides and sole sources. How is that possible? Because the government awards a lot of dollars through 8A contracts. And so some of those 8A contracts that were being awarded went to companies that also had the women-owned designation. And so they took women-owned small business credit for that. And so, 8A set-asides and sole sources, the government awards a lot more of those dollars-wise and numbers-wise than it does women-owned or HUD-owned, for example. The government awards, we're in the middle somewhere on service disabled veteran-owned small business. If you want to contract with the VA, that's your number one certification again. The VA's regulations prioritize veteran-owned small businesses, and there might be something coming for DoD that's not similar that expands DoD's use of SDVOSB and VOSB as well. But so that's what I would say is that while we have this setup where you've got four kind of major socioeconomic certifications, and I don't want to, denigrate in any way your Indian-owned small businesses and such, but those are pretty limited to certain entities, certain agencies that can use that sort of authority. So you've got your four major socioeconomic subcategories, but they're not as equally powerful. And so if you're a woman-owned small business and your game plan is I'm going to rely on woman-owned small business set-asides and sole sources, that's probably not going to work very well for you. I mean, you might get lucky, but you're probably going to need to succeed. You're either going to need to be very competitive in the small business set-aside arena, or you're going to need to get some other certifications. If you're service disabled veteran-owned small business and you're going to sell to VA, you may be able to do a business entirely as an SDVOSB with VA, and it'd be a great business. If you're 8A, that's kind of a double-edged sword because it's a great program. You can rely on it and win tons and tons of work, including a lot of sole source work, but the cert only lasts 9 years and then you're done. And so you better develop some business that's competitive that doesn't rely on 8A to make sure that you survive after those 9 years. So that's what I would say. I would say, look, who do you want to sell to? And go to, and then you can figure out how these dollars are being awarded by that agency. You can use consultants to do this, or you can even do this yourself, going to databases such as the SBA's, they call it the Small Business Data Hub. The Small Business Data Hub breaks down the dollars that the government as a whole and each agency award using these various vehicles. So you can say, wow, I was thinking about getting a HUD zone, but man, the agency I'm targeting barely awards any HUD zone set-asides at all. Is that really worth doing? And I don't, there's always the counterintuitive approach too. And that is to say, look, this agency doesn't award a whole lot of HUD zones, maybe because they don't have many good ones in my industry. So maybe if I get that cert, I can go sell sole source work to that agency too. And I've seen that succeed occasionally, but usually it's more swimming with the stream. Like, hey, this agency here, unlike the others, is doing a lot of WSB set-asides. This office is, so this is a great cert for me, or not. And doing that research on the front end so that you're. One thing with the certifications, and I'm sure you've seen this, especially with 8A, it seems, but with others, is that some folks who are new to the space believe that once you get the cert, the contract just kind of rain down from heaven, right? And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Even with 8A, you always got to do the work, but sometimes the contracts just aren't even really fair at a particular agency in a particular set-aside category. It's good to know that up front before you put your eggs in that basket.
Yeah. And you're right. There are certain agencies who have a preference. You can always tell which agencies are more AA friendly, or will utilize a certain type of set aside a lot more. But yeah, I think that is kind of interesting, and I've heard people start and create consortiums and advocacy groups to start to kind of educate certain agencies or certain organizations to not only be more aware. I think the challenge is with the government acquisition professionals. They are so overworked, right? I am going to be their biggest critic and their biggest advocate all at the same time. And so we do need to kind of be fair. And I think there's a lot of people in industry who will, be critical of the government acquisition professionals, like left and right. But it's an aging, it's an aging workforce. There's a lot of greening right now. There's a lot more, like opportunities and different ways to contract that maybe hadn't been there before. There's a lot of other types of contracting opportunities through SIBRs, sitters, OTAs. There's so many more things than, let's say, when I first started in the business over 20 years ago, before it was so easy, right? And now it's a little bit more complicated. And then you've got a workforce that is very transitioning. There's a lot of requirements now from a reporting perspective, from a due diligence perspective, that is really, really kind of challenging for the acquisition professionals to kind of stay up to date on a lot of these things. So they hit the easy button, and I can't fault them for that. You really, really can't, right? When you're faced with, oh my God, my workload never ends, I'm going to hit the easy button. And so what I advocate to my clients is make it easy for your customers to buy from you, right? Take the time to kind of educate them about things. Make it super easy so they know how to get to you, know how to get to your services, so that they don't have to kind of, think and, work through a lot of red tape and paperwork in order to get, a new contracting opportunity out there. So help them to help you is kind of, what I try to advocate.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, I'll say now what I said essentially to many, many clients who complain about something or other from a contracting officer or contract specialist or whoever it would be that maybe didn't know about a particular rule or didn't know about this or that, and that or was doing something that they didn't, or the client didn't really like. And I said, look, they have a really, really hard job. I mean, as far as this thick, and they're supposed to know the whole dang thing, and work on that, day in and day out. They're not even lawyers, and they're supposed to know all the rules, and then working with all these, all these different, always changing requirements and goals, and so give them some grace. Same with SBA. I'll say, hey, I get it. SBA is resource limited. And they're being asked to do a lot, and so a lot of my criticism from SBA is tempered with and not necessarily the frameworks that we talked about, because they could change that, but just in the day to day, in terms of, are they auditing enough of the subcontract line? So maybe they don't have the resources to do it. I mean, that's probably has something to do with it. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there are folks in the contract acquisition community that shouldn't be there, that aren't very good at their jobs, and so on and so forth. But the vast majority of these folks are doing the best they can. And they've got a lot on their plates. They've got, time crunches and all sorts of competing pressures. And so you're absolutely right. Make it easy for them, and I've had clients who, for example, introduce themselves to, this is one example, and I'm never going to name names of a client, but, got their hub zone. They were the only hub zone in their industry in the area. Went in and met with some contract officers, introduced themselves, and made it easy to say, look, here are the rules. If there are no other hub zones who are going to bid on this work that we do that we're really good at, because you can see our commercial history here, you can award hub zone set-asides below $5 million or whatever the threshold was at that time. Lo and behold, 6 months later, they started getting hub zone sole source contracts. Because they were the only hub zone, they met the requirement, they did the legwork, they introduced themselves, they built the relationship, and they made it easy. They made it easy for the agency that might otherwise have awarded that work under the 8A set-aside, which is easy to say, hey, we're low on our hub zone goals. We can do a hub zone sole source here. Let's do that. And so they got work that way. And it was all from building the relationship, understanding their customer, and then making it easy for the customer to buy from them using that cert. But lining up the rules for that customer and saying, here's why you can give us a sole source contract. We think you verify that. But as far as we can tell, we're the only hub zone in the area that can do this work, and that means that at these dollar values, you can award a sole source, and they were absolutely right. And they got repeated. They got a sole source, and they got a follow on, and and so they built the relationship and made it easy, and got it done.
Yeah. Build the relationship, do your homework, and that's all you can do. So no, that sounds great. And let's wrap up here with our last segment about the future outlook, right? Let's looking ahead. What do you see as the future for the SBA scorecard? Are there any trends or potential reforms that we should be excited about or worried about?
Yeah, and so the Joni Ernst bill is the primary one that I'm aware of right now. We talked about what that bill would do from the scorecard side. I think I'm a little more optimistic about where things are going this year than I have been in the past, and that's because in the past, what I've been seeing, again, this is just anecdotally, big picture wise, it doesn't mean that I got my ear on it. I'm not flying every wall that's out there. But what I've generally seen with these scorecards that year after year after year are almost all A's, and year after year after year they're accompanied by a press release that says the government does the best ever for small business. Look at all our A's, et cetera. It's cheerleading essentially. SBA, and again, this is intended to be constructive criticism, appears to be cheerleading its fellow agencies and itself, by the way, because SBA grades itself more so than taking the even-handed look at how the government is doing on these goals. And that's been kind of depressing to me. And I've been like, hey, everybody, if you actually dig into the meat of this stuff, you'll find that it's a pretty mixed bag. We're still not meeting our hub zone goal. Isn't anyone worried about that? The numbers of government contractors are declining. Isn't anyone worried about that? And some folks, of course, always have been, but it's not really, in my vantage point anyway, seem to reach any sort of critical mass. And so, I am optimistic in that, first of all, we have that bill that Joni Ernst introduced that is, would reform the scorecard and ask for more of a closer look at the industrial base and actually tackle the potential quintuple counting. Second, there have been discussions. There were a number, by the way, at the House Small Business Committee had these discussions about the decreasing number of small businesses that are selling to the government at the prime contract level, which is, for me, is one of the biggest problems that the scorecard masks, is that every year the government's getting A's and touting how many dollars they're awarding at the prime contract level. And I could write next year's press release. It'll be, government awards record number of dollars to small businesses. Yay, everybody's awesome. And that doesn't matter who wins the presidential election. The press release will be pretty much like that, because every year the government awards more dollars to small businesses because every year the government awards more dollars to everybody, and so the pie gets bigger and stuff. But that's the headline, and there'll be no bad news in the scorecard, and yay, it'll be all good news. I could write that now, but it does mask this problem. One of them is the major problems is that the number of small primes has dropped by about 50% over the last 15 years or so, which is an incredible number of drop. It continues to drop. It's dropped like, I think, 14 out of the 15 years that the government's been tracking that. And that's a real problem. The industrial base is shrinking. At small businesses, the dollars are getting bigger and the industrial base is shrinking. Well, I've seen conversations at the House Small Business Committee about that issue. Finally, there are discussions about, hey, we need to take a look at this, that this is actually a problem. We need to talk about more than just the dollars that are being awarded. We need to talk about the number of small primes that are participating in federal contracting, because ultimately the underlying policy, why do we have all these small business set-asides and all this stuff in the first place? And one of the key underlying policies is to have a broad industrial base, is that the good for everybody, for the taxpayer, for the government, for Main Street, if we have a broad base of companies selling to the government at the prime and subcontract levels. And with that base continuing to shrink every year, that does not meet our policy. So having those conversations occurring at the policymaker level, I think, is excellent. That's where we are right now. I think in the short term, next year, it's going to be exactly the same. You're going to see a scorecard that, maybe next year they'll have 23 A's instead of 22. I think it's going to take a little time. But I think finally I'm feeling a little more optimistic that we seem to have reached a place in the GovCon community and in the public policy, the policymaker community, where these issues are out on the table now. They're being talked about, that it's not just people read the first paragraph of the SBA press release and then tweet that out, or I guess not, or X that out if they, I don't know what they use for that platform anymore. But that used to be it. That we just kind of took it for granted that if the scorecard and the SBA press release accompanying it say the government's doing great, it must be great. And that was not you and I necessarily, but those who don't follow this stuff closely. That's the headline. And so I think finally we've gotten to a point where policymakers are going behind those headlines a bit. They're concerned about some of the trends that the scorecard is not capturing. What that will mean for letter grades and the scorecard moving forward, I'm not sure. I think, like I said, next year's scorecard will look pretty much exactly like this one. I can write the press release now, but what does it look like 5 years from now? And I'm hoping by then we'll have, if not the precise reforms that Senator Ernst has proposed, that some reforms either at the congressional level or at the SBA level that help better educate the public on what the government's doing well when it comes to small business contracting and what's doing less well, and that helps at least as by publishing these statements to hold government accountable a little bit. Because one criticism of the small business goals that we see every year, the 23% for small business, 5% for women-owned, is that there's no consequence for failing to meet those goals. And that's always been a tough one. It's like, well, what do? You didn't award enough contracts, so we're dropping your budget. You can't buy many bombers anymore. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But one consequence is getting a C. Just that public knowledge that you're not doing very well is itself a reputational consequence. And so, if we can get to a point where the scorecard can be a better tool to assess how agencies are doing, and some are doing amazingly. Like DHS this year hit all 15 of the markers that I mentioned, all 15, and they got an A+, and DoD hit 5 and got an A. I mean, there's barely any daylight between those two. And so I think we want to, understanding that this is not a criticism of specific odds to boots or federal officials or whatever, still have the scorecard be more reflective of what the government is actually achieving and not achieving when it comes to that. And I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe in the 5-year window we'll get to that point or somewhere closer to it than we are now. But the wheels of change move slowly, and so next year is going to look like it.
Yeah. Well, rinse, repeat. We can only hope. But yeah, I tend to be more on the optimistic side myself too. It's like you can achieve so much more with more positive thinking, more advocacy, more collaboration. And so there are at least a lot of really great organizations out there, like WHIP, for example. We're always advocating for women-owned small businesses and opportunities, fair opportunities, actually, that is, like for the businesses out there, for small and larger women. So as we move to some of our takeaways here, we've talked the whole gamut about different facets of the SBA Small Business Scorecard. Understanding some of the real implications of the scorecard and the grades and what it means behind all the grades, and staying kind of informed on some of the legislative updates that could impact some of the small businesses, while really kind of making sure that we all kind of stay engaged and kind of advocate for your rights and educate both industry and government professionals to make sure that we're being fair and transparent across the different practices, and to just kind of do what we can do to stay competitive and help to kind of educate and elevate the playing field for small businesses in the GovCon industry. So I know that there were a couple of things that were really enlightening with me with how the SBA kind of scores and what it can meet, and doing extra credit for other things that it's just to make their numbers look good. But Steve, were there any other takeaways from our discussion here that you thought that you might want to share before we close?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've pretty much covered the gamut here. Again, I want to repeat that my criticisms of SBA come from a place of I love you, SBA. I really am. That's intended to be constructive. SBA does a lot of wonderful things, and I do understand the resource allocation they have as well. But that said, I mean, bottom line for me is I do think that SBA policymakers, of course, should be taking a look at this too. I hope that SBA will take a look at its own framework and take a look at it from the vantage point of its own its own mission statement, which is to aid, counsel, assist, and protect the interests of small businesses. That's like directly from its website. And I don't. In my opinion, is that this current scorecard is not doing that. It's really aiding, counseling, assisting, and protecting the interests of agencies and looking good. And that's then maybe that's not what SBA intended when they adopted this framework, but it is how it's played out. We've got a framework that really doesn't assist small businesses in understanding how the government is doing when it comes to meeting its goals, and it doesn't assist policymakers in doing that, and it doesn't hold agencies really accountable for missed goals. So I hope SBA will take a look at that on its own sometime, regardless of what the policymakers and Capitol Hill do. But we'll see what happens. See what happens moving forward. I suspect that this will. I'm cautiously optimistic, like I said, now that we've reached this point where we're having this conversation at the policy level, and broader in the government contracting community, there will be some changes moving forward, and so I'll keep my fingers crossed.
And so this concludes our episode here today on the SBA Small Business Scorecard, and our discussion here with Steve Koprince. Please subscribe to our podcast and to stay tuned for future episodes each Wednesday. Thanks, Steve, for joining us here today and sharing your knowledge with us. And you're more than welcome to come back and talk about any other controversial topics, or if we get an update on the topic here today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. Time flies when you're talking Gov. At least it does for me. So I'm looking at it like, wow, we're done already. So thank you again. I'd be happy to come back at some point in the future. It's been a lot of fun.
That sounds great, Steve. Thanks again to our intellectual listeners here today. And to remember, you have to think big to win big. Be an intellectual. And until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of possibilities.